Welcome to this live where we are going to be talking about sex, abstinence, intimacy, and spirituality in Islam. And I'm so excited to be joined by Samira. There she is. Um, Hi, Assalamu alaikum. Hey, there she
Hey,
is.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam. Can you hear me?
I can. How about
Oh,
yourself?
I can't.
You can hear me too.
Yes, I can hear
Perfect.
you. Perfect. All right. So we are going to be having a really great discussion on about a really important topic that doesn't get as much airtime as it should. And I was so excited to connect with you, Samira, because we don't often have Muslims working in this space. To
Right.
find someone who is trained and professional and is available to address these concerns is such a valuable resource. So thank you for what you do.
I appreciate that, Zahra, and I feel really blessed to have this knowledge and grateful for you and others who are open to having this conversation because without that, the work would be just me speaking to myself. So I'm really glad that I can share it as much as I can.
Yes. So please, can you give us a little intro on yourself for everyone?
Sure. Salams, everyone. So awesome that you could join us. I'm Samira. I run a platform called Sexual Health for Muslims. It's relatively new in terms of this work as an individual. And I've been in the field of mental and sexual health for about 11 years, working in Muslim spaces, starting in Canada. And then I'm in the DC area right now, where I've lived for about 5 years. And I have been developing curriculum, teaching sexual health, and working with Muslims across their entire lifespan of all ages. And Sexual Health for Muslims is my way of bringing online sex ed to Muslims. So it is taking a lot of my learnings over the last decade and really bringing in spirituality into the conversation, which I know we'll be talking about because it's really missing in so many areas of our lives as Muslims.
Yes, it totally is. For those who might be new to my page, Practical Muslim, I really focus on bringing back that spirit of Islam, right? We've gotten so caught up in the rules. Oh, the rule is don't have sex, and the rule is, wear socks when you pray, and the rule is this and that. And we have all these rules, and then we don't know why. We don't know what's the benefit. We don't know what happens if we don't follow the rule. We just have this concept of this is the rule, you better obey it. If you do, you're good. If you don't, you're bad. But without a deeper understanding, a deeper appreciation to how it benefits us, how it can harm us, it's hard to adhere to those rules. And that's why we see so many people like either feeling disconnected from faith because, I don't want to just be mindlessly following these rules. And then if that means that I'm not part of this faith or, I'm not a strong adherent, then I'm not going to be a strong adherent. When the truth is for so many people, like their heart and their faith within them is so strong and is so connected. And if they could reconnect to that deeper understanding and that deeper appreciation, it just reinvigorates their whole relationship with themselves and with Allah. So it's so wonderful for you to bring us that perspective on such a hugely important topic of sex and intimacy and abstinence so that we can have that spiritual backing to
Mhm.
why I'm going to, engage in sex or not engage in it or whatever the case may be.
Right. And I think everything that you said about your work is exactly what I find with mine is that we so often focus on the what, and without the why and the how, we don't have roadmaps, we don't have safety nets, we don't have different routes that we can take. And so a lot of us find that we're struggling in terms of we have this value and we have an idea of what we want, but without strategies and self strengths to get there, it's really hard to follow through on it.
Exactly. So I'll start with some questions that we had talked about. So when we're talking about abstinence, what does that mean, generally
Yeah,
speaking?
good place
Mhm.
to start. I feel like everybody has a different definition. And when it comes to talking about Islam and different faith traditions, they all have pretty much the same definition of abstaining from sexual activity, specifically sexual intercourse before marriage. And so a lot of Muslims in general will say, well, does that mean that everything apart from sexual intercourse is allowed? And I think Islam means that we have to kind of go in and search for the various rulings ourselves and understandings. But from an Islamic perspective, it generally means abstaining from all sorts of sexual activity before marriage. And there's Christians that talk about abstinence, there's Jewish folks, and anyone who's from a faith tradition. It's not just Muslims. And we know that abstinence-based sex ed, which we might talk about today, is what's happening here. So it's a super well-known term, but the definition's not always really known.
Okay, well, that's really a great place to have that clarification, because you do hear that question, like, is it only, like, where's the line, and people looking for the line. So in your experience, what are the issues that Muslims are facing when it comes to abstinence?
Yeah, so quite a few. So because abstinence is mostly taught using fear-based perspectives, in terms of if you don't abstain before sex, you will go to hell, etc. That's a very negative way to teach about abstinence. It's not empowering, it's very fear-based, it causes a lot of internalized shame. So Muslims don't understand the why and the how if they choose abstinence as a value. The second issue that comes up is that Muslims are actually having sex before marriage. And so because they don't understand things such as safe practices, there's an abundance of sexually transmitted infections, there's pregnancies happening, and all sorts of also deep inner spiritual consequences that people just don't know how to reconcile if they realize that they may have done something that goes against their values. And so when we talk about abstinence and what we're seeing, all of these issues is because we use fear-based perspectives. We don't have context about why and how to abstain. And so I believe Muslims don't have all the information they need to make decisions that are healthy. And so they're kind of left to navigate this territory without much support.
Yeah, so, definitely for me growing up, it was the fear-based, messaging. So what would be a different way to message this?
Yeah, so fear-based messaging is what we hear a lot. And the other side of that coin is empowered abstinence. So instead of saying things like, you have to protect your virginity or else God will punish you, no one will marry you, the honor of your family, et cetera, we want to do the flip side of that and have people understand that I see sex as a spiritual act of worship within marriage. And although I will experience sexual desire and arousal, I have strategies to be able to manage that. And I will focus on self-development. I will focus on other aspects of my life in terms of getting to know someone. And when we are married, I have a value of then sharing intimacy because we've developed time to strengthen our spiritual and emotional relationship. And physical intimacy is a culmination of that. So we want to give people empowered language because then it becomes, like you said, an internalized value instead of something that is like a ton of bricks on your shoulders and you're feeling the weight, but you're not really sure like why and how and what happens if I have feelings, because we don't acknowledge that Muslims will experience desire and arousal and different sexual feelings even while you're abstinent, right? So then how do you deal with all of that? And so I think that those are some of the really complicated things that we have to be teaching Muslims to kind of manage in their journey.
I mean, one thing for me that I learned, I don't know if it was before I got married or while I was married, but someone had said to me that sex is the glue of a marriage. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And, as a relationship coach, I work with singles who are looking for their soulmate, but I also work with married people who are struggling in their marriage, that they're feeling disconnected, that they are not feeling fulfilled in their marriage. And a big part of the fulfillment comes from intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
And these couples will describe essentially being roommates with their spouse, that he and she are living their separate lives. They come together to discuss logistics, who's picking up what and doing this and going where. But there's no real emotional connection. There's no real spiritual connection, and there's no real intimate connection.
Right.
So without having sex, they are in a marriage, they've lost the glue that makes it a marriage. And so now they've gotten into a situation of becoming roommates. So it's so interesting that we also don't talk about this piece, that that within Islam, like, sex is encouraged between a husband
Right.
and a wife. It is, it is blessed, it is encouraged, and it is because it is the glue. It is the only relationship where you're allowed to engage in this intimate act, and that act brings, it's like, it is the physical act that is the expression of the spiritual and emotional connection. When you're spiritually and emotionally connected, then when you engage in this intimate act, it is the glue. It all comes together. Now, on all three levels, spiritual, emotional, physical, you are connected. And so something that I think about, with people who engage in the physical act of sex outside of marriage, either, as a external, they're married and they're having an affair, or premarital sex, is you're engaged in the physical act, but do you have the spiritual and emotional connection? And sometimes it feels like the physical act can substitute for those, can bring on the feelings of, like, I am emotionally connected, I so feel it now, but it was really only the physical act. And people don't appreciate that now, when you've engaged in that act and you weren't truly having the physical, spiritual and emotional, and now you distance yourself, or you break up or whatever, why the heartbreak is so painful and the emotions is because, you took something that is sacred, that binds people, and you used it without all the binding. And so, there's the tear that happens from using something outside of its purpose.
Right. Yeah, I really like how you describe that. And I want to also add that the way you described it is not how Muslims get educated about sex. It's, we don't hear this context. And so one of the things I want to say is that for those folks who are joining who may think that, I've engaged in sex outside of marriage, I haven't been abstinent. This is not a place where we're bringing judgment or shame to that. I think it's really important that everybody understands you're on your own journey. And I come with a philosophy, and it sounds like, Zahra, you're the same, that we all make decisions and do the best that we can based on the information that we have. And I really wish, like, everything that we're talking about was kind of packaged and given to youth before they experience, desire, arousal, get into relationships, because then that's prevention. And then that's also not only surviving, but it's thriving, right? Like, you have all the information, then you make a decision. But, without holistic perspectives of sex, like, why should Muslims delay sex for marriage if they're not understanding about, like, why they should, It remains this, we don't talk about it. And also, like you said, Muslims are struggling in marriage. It's because we're not even taught to understand, like, how sex works. We are learning about it from pornography, we're learning about it from media, and we see it as actually a physical act. It's funny, I think a lot of married couples see sex as a physical act that's simple, and we actually know that sex is very complicated. So the time that we are choosing to be abstinent means that you should be educating yourself about sex and learning about yourself in that way. So when you do enter a marriage, you're not expected to flip on a light switch and have sex with your spouse. You actually have knowledge, you understand your own body, you've talked with your fiance or spouse about intimacy. So abstinence doesn't mean don't learn about sex. It means, like, choosing not to engage in it and saying, I still need to prepare spiritually, mentally, and physically, and this is what I'm going to focus on, is myself and my development.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. So let's see how, with all that we've talked about, and looking forward at, okay, well, let's use the example of a Muslim who has engaged in premarital sex and now is feeling the pain from
Yeah,
doing that and realizing or recognizing for themselves that, like, you know what, I want to make the decision that I'm not going to do that again. How
right.
can they support themselves to kind of heal from that and navigate, maybe the next potential person that they talk to,
Yeah,
has that same request? Well, we need to check if we're sexually compatible.
right, right. Huge myth. Um, so first of all, while it's important to distinguish shame from guilt in terms of doing something outside of your values. So Brene Brown talks about this a lot, where she says guilt is understanding that you did something wrong, like did something wrong. Shame is feeling inherently unworthy or bad or broken because you did something wrong. So it's internalized. I think it's not healthy to feel shame because we know what shame does in terms of our ability to process and work through choices that we've made that go against our values. It's really hard when we are feeling like we're unworthy of Allah forgiving us and even us forgiving ourselves. If we feel guilty, that's a bit easier to work with in terms of you are separating your self-worth and identity as a Muslim spiritually from an action that you did. So, first of all, I tell folks all the time, take time to reflect on your values of why you would like to be abstinent and how your actions maybe went against that and how it makes you feel. I don't know if we have time to process enough of that. We kind of just want to be able to work through it, but processing is challenging and we need to do that. So, sitting with our thoughts, using practices such as journaling, mindfulness, spiritual invocation, meditation, and really understanding what led me to go against my values, and what can I do now to move forward, acknowledging that we are all human, we all make mistakes, Allah is all forgiving, and I'm making it sound easy. It's more just it's a repetitive practice that we have to engage in. And then moving forward, I tell people once you know your values, you want to practice communicating them assertively. So, for example, when my now husband and I were seeing each other, I think it was after about a month, because we lived in the same city, we talked about our physical boundaries. So I was very clear that I have a value of no sex before marriage. And he's like, I'm on the same page. And so, we're both previously divorced. And so we had comfort, I think, from our past experiences asserting ourselves. But from very early on, we talked about like, how are we going to navigate our dating relationship? What are we going to be doing? What are we not going to be doing? And just that, and not in and of itself, made me feel good in terms of my values are now on the table. And if he respects them, alhamdulillah, that's a sign. If he doesn't, that's also a sign that I need to kind of think about if he's not respecting my values and trying to push back. So I always say, and you just said something similar, you start on the inside. So what are your values? How can you work with those guilt feelings that you have, and then communicating them in a way saying, these are my needs in this beginning of our relationship or wherever stage you're in. I'd like to know what your needs are and how we can actually work as a team. So you're not feeling like you're alone, and knowing that feelings will come up, desire will come up, and your values being on the table is actually a really great first step to working together to accomplish your goals.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's great. I love that you shared the example of having that conversation with your husband before you got married. Similarly, for me, before I got married, I was that typical Muslim girl who like didn't know about sex, only knew what she saw in the movies and the media, and like was just so afraid, like, nobody touched me. I'm not supposed to date. Like, I just know boys, right? And then here I am, like talking to this guy to get married, and um, my husband at the time was very much open about, like, he's like, well, we need to talk about sex. And I was like, what? I was like, oh my God, like, Muslim
No, we
brother,
don't.
like, who are you? Where did you come from? Like, we don't talk about that. He's like, no, it's really important for us just to have this conversation. And so we did. And at the same time that we were talking, actually, a friend of mine was going through a divorce, She had only been married for 6 months. And when she finally opened up, like, what's going on? Why are you getting a divorce? She's like, well, we've never had sex. And we after a couple of weeks, we moved into separate bedrooms, and it's just, we're roommates. It's just a thing. And like,
Yeah.
they were trying to hide it and work it out, but like it wasn't working out. So after 6 months, here they are getting a divorce. And we just had gone to her wedding, and then she's telling me, I'm getting a divorce because of no sex. And then the guy I'm talking to was like, we need to talk. So I was like, okay, all right, I get it. I understand. We do. So we talked about like, is there anything that you would be uncomfortable with? Right. Cause I was a virgin. I had not, had a boyfriend. I had no experience. So just, having the conversation, is there anything that you would be worried about, be uncomfortable about? Is there any, thing you have questions about? And we talked about these things. It was kind of like academic and scientific, but it was uncomfortable, but also really liberating to be like, wow, like this is something that I don't have to just hide in the darkness, that, that I don't know. I can say I don't know, and I can say, well, I think I'll be comfortable with this. I think that something like this, I wouldn't be, whatever it was. And that conversation in and of itself, like, helped us become closer, helped us so that, when the wedding night did come, that it wasn't all of this anxiety and fear and worry. And really supported me in a way to just kind of understand that it's a facet of marriage. It's not just this huge like elephant in the room that nobody can talk about. Like, we can talk about it. And even my husband's like, before we got married, it's like, we should go get AIDS tests. And I was like, what? Like, I've never touched it. It was like, no, we should do it. So we went and we got AIDS tested and but it was just very, I just felt that it was like a growing up moment for myself, to be like, okay, I'm saying I want to get married. I want to be a wife. And this is a huge part of marriage. And if I can't even talk about it, like, how is it going to be that I'm going to be able to, engage in it and be comfortable with it and all of those things. So I totally agree with you and recommend to everyone watching that if you're single and you're talking with someone, that, talk about money, talk about, your family, the things that you want, and then talk about sex, talk about, your what you're worried about, what you're looking forward to, talk about all of it. Because again, more so than even what's actually said is the ability to have the conversation and how you respond to one another. There's an intimacy just in the way that you can converse around these personal topics, finances, sex, family, upbringing. If you can address these personal topics with each other with compassion, you're already setting yourselves up for intimacy. Like, I would even consider it like, a long form of foreplay, basically.
Yes. And like you said, there's surprisingly, well, not surprising, there's a lot of research that says that if married couples struggle with talking about sex and intimacy, it's more likely that they have dissatisfaction with their sex lives. So there is something about being able to talk. And when we think about intimacy during marriage, it's not a silent process between spouses. Pleasure is not something that your spouse will get right away. And unless you want to just not give feedback or just, pretend that things are pleasurable when they're really not, you're going to have to talk to each other in much more intimate detail than, I don't want to have sex before marriage, and we won't go there today. But there are things that you may have to guide your spouse to understand. So if we can't even have a conversation about values, how can you then talk about sexual pleasure and the types of touches and the context of foreplay that you need, whether you need time to be aroused or whether you're someone who's more spontaneous? These are all so critical. And yet we have to start somewhere. So I think starting early within the dating relationship is really important to have the awareness and language.
Yes. I love that. And so you had touched on this before, but I think it's a good thing to go back to. for the, for someone who grew up like me, like I didn't learn anything about sex from my parents really, or from, I had sex ed in school, but that was really more about like learning about your menstrual cycle and those things.
Yes. Yep.
What do you support Muslims with when they're feeling that sexual arousal and they're having these questions, or, they might have concerns like, why am I being aroused,
Yeah.
when I am, I'm committed to having this value of not, like, I shouldn't even feel aroused. Do you find people struggle with that?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of really good information about what sexual response is. And so all of us have this super simplified understanding that sex equals turned on, right? Or turned off. Like we see things as kind of a light switch, as a very simple mechanism, and we'll often call sex as being this biological drive. And those are both actually not true. Sex is very, very complicated. So one example of that is there's something called arousal non-concordance, which is really easy to understand. It sounds complicated. Our genitals are wired to be biologically aroused by a lot of different stimuli, especially in men. Men will actually experience a physical arousal, but in their brains, they're not actually aroused. And it happens with women as well. So sometimes Muslims may feel like, oh, I'm getting an erection, or I'm feeling warm, or, I'm feeling aroused and lubricated. That's a physical arousal. It doesn't mean that you're actually feeling mentally, emotionally aroused and that you want to engage in sex or some sort of sexual pleasure, because everything originates in the brain. And so for Muslims to understand that, if you can imagine, is really important, because there may be things that, arouse you in your genitals, but then in your head and your emotions, in your brain, in your spirit, you're like what's going on? So because we're all wired differently, it's really important to understand this and to separate this idea of arousal from desire, because they're two different systems, right? So arousal is a response, and desire means like wanting it. So I think for Muslims to understand that there's a complexity of sexual response that we all have, and unless we understand like what may arouse us either like physically or in our heads, what context may help us feel more aroused, then we can't really work on channeling that to help support abstinence before marriage, if that makes sense, right? Because we automatically think just repress, repress, repress. And all the data shows that that doesn't work, because arousal, desire, pleasure is all very complicated. And the more we learn about our own bodies, how we're wired, what arousal feels like, and then how do we also, use our spirituality and our emotions and energy to channel it, not repress it, then what tools do we have to deal with it? And so that's just one example of what Muslims need to learn about sex. Is the mechanism of understanding how we're wired can actually help us and support us be abstinent, because we know more about ourselves.
Okay, so then can you share more about Islamic psychology and spirituality with regards to abstinence?
Yeah, so I've been doing a lot of readings, especially by Imam al-Ghazali, who's one of, the best experts and scholars on Islamic psychology. And like people often ask, where does sexual desire like come from? And when you look at Islamic psychology, we have different levels of our ego. And one of the levels of those egos is what's called our animal nafs, or the animal ego. And that's kind of the lowest kind of basal feelings that we have, like hunger, thirst, the need to keep warm, and also sexual feelings can come from there. So when we're describing a sort of like immediate physiological response, it might be because it's coming from our lower ego. And so Islam sees sex during marriage as taking Islamic spirituality. So what we learn about Islamic spirituality, what we practice in our heart, and elevating that desire to a place where it's in line with spirituality at that point, which is in marriage. So it's not about stunting the feeling or repressing it. It's about acknowledging that it's going to be there. And then how do we kind of channel that using spiritual methods? Islam itself has methods such as fasting, trying to marry when you can, obviously controlling what your eyes, ears, and other senses are exposed to. Like there's wisdom in that, because if we believe that Islam is a divine religion, then that was revealed for a reason. And also learning about Islamic spirituality, doing spiritual practices, that can all help us acknowledge that we have, a sexual response, and we can elevate it in terms of using our spirituality to make it sacred during marriage.
That's beautiful. Yeah. And so when do you think that Muslims should be learning about sex and abstinence?
Yeah, a lot of people think like later in life, but I'm gonna say from what I've seen, I've worked in Islamic schools, I do a lot of work with parents. Kids are often exposed to pornography and information about sex from their peers before they hit puberty. So we're seeing the ages of 8 to 10 as being the age where kids have been exposed, even accidentally. And so without information to circumvent that, there's not much that they have to critically think about sex and what's healthy and not so healthy in terms of Islamic values. So when I was teaching sex ed in middle school, it was around grades 5 or 6 where we talked about sex in more detail. Very simply, we used examples of life cycles and how people grow and develop. We talked about the verse in the Quran that talks about, we are from a clot, and it kind of talks about the evolution of the embryo and then comes forth a child. So ideally, we want to be learning this in adolescence. We start with some information and then we add more complex information as we get older. But because kids know a lot more than their parents think they know, it's really important to get in there with the Islamic values. And so by the age, let's say, of graduating high school, you have information about healthy relationships, healthy intimacy in marriage. You understand how to stay safe during sex, how to ask your future spouse to get STI testing, for example. Like, these are all things that are needed in your toolbox before you get into a relationship, because once you're in that relationship, it can be easy to lose sight of all the practical things that you need to be talking about, because emotions can take over and you lose perspective and objectivity. So I say the earlier the better, for sure.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. It does make sense. But as you're talking, my son is about to turn 10 next month. I'm like, oh my God, do I need to talk to this?
Deep
Oh
breath,
God.
Sarah. There's a lot of tools now. There's a lot of amazing Muslim professionals supporting parents. And I always tell parents when I share information about when they start to panic, and I say, look, like, deep breath. It's never too late. And it's all about empowering you as a parent with information and comfort before you start conversation. So parents first, and then kids, and no panic and no rush.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, even, watching so much TV during quarantine, you notice like the British and European sensibility around sex is like just more natural, or like the humor around it, and like the stuff they talk about, the scenes they show, and we kind of realize like that America is such a prude society, that we are just like so uptight and nervous, and that we don't talk about it, and so it's interesting the way that you're sharing it. Like, we can discuss that this is such an important topic, and we can discuss it in healthy ways, and we don't have to think about it as like just all of it is just vulgar. It's like blanket vulgar, and it's like,
Yeah.
no, it's not just it's not just all porn, it's not just all vulgar. There
Yeah.
room within it to talk about yes, like the miracle of life, and two people coming together, and all of this other the spirituality of it that we can share with if we're talking with someone and with our kids.
Yeah. And something I say is that when we think about how God created us, all parts of us were created in a sacred divine way. And that includes the sexual parts of us. And that also means that we're not sexual beings from birth to death in terms of being sexually active. And there are important skills that we need so that when we are sexually active, we understand, for example, when you're a young child, like how to say that my body is mine and yours is yours, that I don't want that kind of a touch. That when you start to menstruate, that you understand your body and what your cycle means and how to detect if you need support from a professional, all the way to getting, pap smears before you're sexually active, because cervical cancer, ovarian cancer are hard to detect without getting pap smears. So it's also physical health, and Islam is a religion of prevention. And if we don't have what we need to even take care of our physical health related to our sexual health, then how can we amplify our sexual lives with our spouses without that basic level of understanding and comfort with our bodies? So, a lot of men and women deal with shame around their bodies. They're dealing with pelvic pain and they don't talk about it. They've endured trauma, and they now have struggles with being intimate with their spouse. All of these issues that manifest in marriage are actually could have been addressed downstream because they show up in childhood and adolescence. So it's a matter of like spirituality and fulfillment. And from a basic level of Islam as a religion of prevention, health information is really critical. So that's a place to start because it's tangible. And like you said, the way we talk about sexual health, the language we use elevates it. So the way I educate is nothing of what you'll see like in mainstream media in terms of sex. As Muslims, I think there's a sacred way to talk about our bodies. There's a sacred way to talk about sex. And that can even elevate it, right? It almost brings it to a level of, it is dignity. It's your body has been entrusted in terms of you have one body from birth to death. So if we can give Muslims a language of dignifying how to talk about sex and sexual health, then inshallah, we're giving them the tools to then share, spiritually satisfied sex in marriage.
That's great. And we did have a question here. Someone said, when is the right time to start talking about sex with your proposed wife? Who is supposed to initiate the conversation, and how can you feel secure if I decide to initiate the conversation?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I would say that even though you may bring up the conversation and that might give you a lot of feelings of like, why am I bringing it up? This is awkward. What are they going to think about me? I think the person who brings it up is actually taking a huge step. So there's a lot of, and you mentioned relationship coaching, Zahra, but there's actually a lot of tools out there for Muslims on like 13 or 15 topics that you should be talking with your potential spouse about. So if you bring up the topic of sex in relation to your values, like I did when I was getting to know my husband, the conversation's open. So, it was practical in terms of we're living in the same city, we're attending these events together, we're getting to know each other. We need to talk about like physical boundaries, obviously, especially as we get comfortable and our emotions start to kick in. So that was the practical aspect of it. And I think that's a way to do it. And if you're further down in your relationship, let's say you're engaged or you're about to be married, then you can bring it up in terms of, I know we'll be sharing sexual intimacy during marriage and sex. And I'd like to talk about that, not only in terms of what I want and need, but in terms of ensuring that you have what you need and want, and that we're comfortable together as we, take these steps to further our relationship. So being vulnerable is a good thing. So saying that I'm really nervous, I don't know if I have the right words, that will go a long way in making the other person feel like, oh, thank God, because I feel the exact same way too. And I'm glad you don't have it all figured out.
Yes, yes. And I know, as a relationship coach, we kind of, we see also the dynamics, the men and women, that like women may have this perception that like, oh, guys always want it and they're always,
Yeah.
going to be the one to initiate, and that girls are supposed to be shy and reserved, and, I'm not supposed to, talk about it. And so that those roles, the societal roles, can be, can prevent you from engaging in these important discussions, and also from misreading the cues about what's going on, right? That, you know, we have, as a relationship coach, you have men want to feel desired. They want a woman, you know, their wife, or to tell them they look handsome and you look so sexy and all of those things. It's not just that the man is constantly directing attention to the woman and the one initiating. They want the woman to sometimes initiate too. There's a balance that, you know, that they can feel secure, right? If we talk about consent and those things, they can feel secure that, like, this is something that you are enjoying and getting pleasure out of too, and you, to the point that you'd be willing to initiate it. And same thing for women to have the courage to be vulnerable, to state or share, or, you know, act in a way that makes clear that, yes, I am interested, you know, in intimacy with you. And this is more so talking about once a couple is married, but it plays out even before, because in the ability to have that conversation, if you just fall into those gender roles of the girl supposed to be like, oh no, I can't talk about it, and the guy supposed to be like, well, this is what I'm gonna want, and this is what, you know, this is how I want things, you know, we're gonna have sex every day and blah blah blah, it can be really harmful, because once you actually get married, you'll realize, like, that, you know, those norms are just like fake made up Hollywood fantasies. It's not how it actually works.
Yes. Yeah, really, really important points. I think getting our heads out of what we have learned to unlearn them is so important. Like I often tell Muslims, like, you have, like, just erase your mind of everything that you learned about sex until now, because it's most likely from, you know, media, social media, pornography, peers, and it's not accurate. And that's not just Muslims, right? It's a lot of folks who don't get comprehensive sex ed. So the more that we can learn about how we're wired and what we need and communicate that, I think the healthier for our sexual intimacy in marriage.
Okay, there was another question. Someone said, how does one go about educating themselves about sex and knowledge in this area?
Yeah, so on my page, which on my profile, there's a highlight called resources. And so there's about 14 or 15 books that I recommend in terms of learning about sex. There's one in particular called Come As You Are, and that is all about the science of sexuality and sex. And it has activities and exercises for you to actually self-reflect on yourself and to determine your values and determine how your body responds, and then ways that you can channel it. So I think if we can, that's one example, and I'm happy to share more in terms of posting after. And I kind of take that information and break it down even more, because what I'm seeing is that with Muslims, there's a lot of unlearning that needs to be done as well. Because all of us have just a very simple model of what sex is, and it's often incorrect. So those resources are a great place to start. And I can also share other sex educators on Instagram, Muslim and otherwise. I think with other sex educators, what I tend to do is take the information, and then we can apply Islamic spirituality and psychology to it. So that's why it's important to know your values. So you can take information from a non-Muslim perspective, because it's helpful, it's sex-based information, apply your lens to it, and then you can implement it in your own lives instead of just kind of discarding it away. I think a lot of information about sex is from non-Muslim sources, so I'm inshallah trying to change that, and we can still take it and use our values to apply that kind of filter that we want, so that it's in line with who we are.
Yes, I love that. And that's something that I'm all about at Practical Muslim, because so much of the spirituality and the spirit of Islam, the heart of Islam that I talk about, a lot of it I learned actually from non-Muslim sources. And I was like, this is Islam. Like, why don't we teach it like this? And then I just repackaged it and put our Islamic trappings on it, because it truly is an Islamic concept. We just have, you know, lost sight of it, or don't discuss it, or favor other things instead of it. And so for those who follow my page or who are new here, when you look at what I'm offering, hopefully it allows you to appreciate and see those same principles in Christian sources, in secular sources. You know, people talk a lot about mindfulness and being in tune with the universe right now and all of those things. And you don't have to just dismiss those people. You can substitute universe for Allah, and you will find that, oh my gosh, it all falls in line when I open my mind to appreciate what is being shared and apply my, like you said, Islamic lens filter on top of it. It fits. It's not that they're over here and we're over there. It's really all the same. It's just that, you know, they're missing our lens and we can add our lens to it.
Yeah, and somebody brought up this point. The Village Auntie, you know, Angelica Lindsay Ali has been phenomenally working for decades in this field. And so she is somebody at the Village at Village Auntie that is incredible at this work. She already has the Islamic perspective and spirituality, and talks about things like desire and being able to have pleasurable intimacy and sex in such a beautiful, holistic way. So she's a go-to in terms of I think the Muslim who's at the forefront of this work and has been for such a long time.
That's great. Well, it's so great to know that there are more of you doing this important work. So there's another question here, and someone said, how does one know that they are ready? I'm assuming, how do they know that they're ready for sex?
Yeah, I'd like to get that clarified in terms of what do you mean, ready to chat about sex? Because there's a lot of questions about that, or ready to
Oh, I
have
see.
sex.
Okay,
Yeah,
so at
yeah.
Animal Keeper 18, if you're still on, if you could clarify your question for us, that would be great. But then, okay, so we have, okay, I think we've already answered that, but it's really never too early to have that conversation around
Right.
sex. It should
No.
be one of the, so, you know, in general, when we are talking about, so I'm going to put on my coaching hat now for a second. For single people talking about having these conversations with their potential future spouse, that you should be having important conversations first. You should not really be spending the majority of your time just talking about how your day was and what you're doing at school and what your coworkers were up to and blah, 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 and just kind of this chit chat. Because what you're going to find is that you will make an emotional connection with just like enjoying their company and having this rapport with them, but you haven't actually done checked your compatibility, that you're actually compatible on a values, spiritual, you know, outlook on life, worldview, your ambitions for what you're trying to achieve and where you're trying to go. If you stay at this kind of surface level chit chat area, which it lends itself very easily to through using apps and online, that you just kind of gauge in this chit chat. What you really want to be doing when you first start getting to know someone is diving deep into these questions. How did you grow up? What were your parents like? What is your model of a husband and wife? What are your views on Islam? What sheikhs do you follow, or lectures do you listen to, and books do you read? How do you think about men and women's roles in a marriage and for yourself? And what is your views on finances? What is your financial state? Do you have debt? Then sex. What are your views on, have you had sex? You know, have you had a traumatic sexual experience? Has someone you know had it that's impacted you? What are your fears around it? You should be having those types of conversations from the jump, from the beginning. After you kind of establish like one or two conversations that like, okay, I kind of like your in general tone, then immediately you go into these deeper questions. And sex should be, you know, you can put it after like childhood, financial, whatever. Once you're like, okay, all of those are in line, now we'll talk about sex. But it really should be up there in terms of when you're engaging it. And every time that you meet a potential person, even if you're feeling like, oh my God, I have to start all over, I'm talking to someone new, really treat it as, this could be my future life partner, and I want to be open and honest and expressive with them. And so I want to share all these important things about what I think and what I believe and how I see the world. And I want to hear those things from them. And I want to be really vulnerable with them so that I can set myself up for a good marriage, right? Because if they are the one and it is going to work out, it will only work out because you did this groundwork at the beginning. You can't kind of, well, I'm not really going to talk about this, and I'm not going to tell the truth about this, and I'm just going to pretend I'm okay with this, and then like, okay, now we're getting married, and then think that you're going to have a successful marriage when you were unable to really be vulnerable and honest in the beginning. And I know it seems weird, like I'm just going to be so vulnerable and honest with a stranger. Yeah, you are.
Yeah.
And if you don't get to, if you break up at that beginning, you know, people fear like, oh my God, what are they going to say? But you actually really don't know them, and they probably don't know too many of your people, and they're not going to tell anyone, right? They won't
Yeah.
tell anyone. So there's no lose, and there's tremendous gain from having these conversations early on with your potential.
Yeah. Yeah, that question is a really good question in terms of should we be asking these ourselves or explore it when you ask? So I've done healthy relationship workshops before, and one of the things I tell Muslims is that use the time in which you are single and even in a relationship to focus on self-development. And self-development can't come without self-awareness. So, one of the first activities in that workshop is doing an inventory of yourself in terms of your experiences, your knowledge, what are your values for yourself, values for your spouse, what have been your experiences, both traumatic, positive, learning experiences. Like the more that we create this inventory of self-awareness, then I think not only have we gained awareness about ourselves, but we're probably comfortable having that conversation because you can think about how to communicate it. So, for example, like if you have gone through a traumatic experience, and for safety reasons, you want to share that with someone that you're talking to early, then being aware that you've had trauma and sharing it in as little or as much detail as you want. I advise little before you get into all the details. Then you're creating that safety net between you and someone you're communicating with, for example. But without the awareness, then we can't talk about it. Same thing, like for example, a lot of people ask, how much do I reveal about past sexual experiences when I'm seeing somebody? And I like to remind Muslims that anything that we do is between us and Allah ultimately. And nobody has a right to ask for incessant details about your sexual experiences if you have been previously married or previously dating or whatever the situation is. You don't want to be giving people like your journal and just being like, hey, read it. Like, and if somebody asks for that, I often want advise Muslims like they're it, think about why they're asking it. The intention might not actually be always helpful. There are people who end up being harmful or abusive down the road, and it starts with gaining control over somebody and knowing all the details in their lives, for example. So if you're talking about your past sexual experiences, it's from a perspective of safety of yourself and the safety and well-being of both of you. So for example, like you could share, I have been communicating with people online. I have been engaged before. I have not had sex before. And if somebody is asking if you've had sex before, it should ideally be framed from, should we get sexually transmitted infection testing? I want to ensure that like you're healthy and we're both healthy if we're getting married. So I think the intention behind why you're asking somebody about their past sexual experiences is really important. And for both parties and everyone to know that all of our actions are between us and Allah, and you are not required to share intimate details about your past sexual experiences with somebody. And that the intention of sharing and asking should be for the benefit of both of you in terms of immediate well-being and future health, not for the sake of, well, there's knowing intimate details in terms of like where this person is in terms of your assessment of their morality, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a complicated topic, but wanted to bring that in because that's something that a lot of Muslims ask about.
Yeah, that's really great. And kind of just like what we were talking about before, start with the topics, and they should get deeper and deeper and more vulnerable and more intimate types of topics and conversations as you go. And if like you're feeling bad vibes when you're talking about, childhood upbringing or about their parents,
Yeah.
then, you know, you should already cut it off there. That's a red flag, and you don't need to go to talk about finances and then
Right.
intimacy and all of those things.
Yeah.
So
Um,
we only have like 3 more minutes before Instagram cuts us off. So Samira, I'd love for you to tell people, you know, how they can stay in contact with you, what services that, if you provide services for single people, for married people. I know you already talked about what you do for parents helping children, but yes, how can people work with you and learn more?
yeah. Yeah, so one quick question somebody asked. So an article by the New York Times is called 13 Questions to Ask Your Potential Spouse. So you can Google that, and I think you might have seen it, Zahra. It's an awesome list of
Yes.
questions, but just so someone is asking. So my platform, Sexual Health for Muslims, right now is all online sex ed. So I'll be releasing 2 webinars pretty soon in March about Islam and sexual health, and then Sex Ed 101 for Muslim women. And I also offer one-on-one education. So it can be really hard to book a Zoom meeting with me and to talk about sexual health because it can be uncomfortable. But I do offer that. So I've had a few folks reach out and say, how do I heal from trauma? How do I learn about sexual health? How do I learn about sex? And I'm like, it's really hard to email about this. Let's chat in person. Sorry, virtually, in terms of that. So I offer really affordable rates for that. So that's something that you can email me about. And I work with everyone in terms of single Muslims, people in relationships, Muslims who are married, parents. I've done kind of the lifespan approach with sexual health. So if people have questions, I usually am able to answer them. And then if they need therapy or other resources, I refer them to that. So I'm not a therapist or a counselor, I'm an educator. A lot of what you do is what I do in terms of coaching and providing support and providing resources and critical thinking, which is, I think, what's lacking. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, feel free to reach out. And I do a lot of free education on my Instagram platform as well.
Perfect. So I will tag you and put all the links, inshallah, that I can once I post this up and save this live. And for anyone who's new to me and my platform, I am a spiritual coach. I focus on relationships, those single looking to get married and married couples looking to improve and enhance their marriage. And this has been a conversation around sex, abstinence, and spirituality, what you need to learn, how you can navigate the space, how you can navigate feeling arousal, how you can navigate managing abstinence, how you can manage that after you've already been sexually active and now you want to have abstinence. We've touched on so many different things. So I think this is a conversation that people should go back and rewatch if you jumped in the middle. And if there are any other questions that you guys have about this, please feel free to leave them in the comments, and maybe we will be blessed enough to get Samira back here again for a follow-up conversation, because there's really so much that we can benefit from keeping this out in the open, discussing it more. And you can, I'm sure you could feel free to DM Samira, and you can
Mhm.
also DM me as well if you don't feel comfortable leaving your questions in the comments. So inshallah,
Thank
thank you
you
again
so
so much
much.
for joining me.
Of course. Thank you for creating this space, for all the work that you do, your compassion, and to everyone also for coming. It's sometimes hard to join these events, and inshallah it was beneficial, and we're both here to support you on your journeys.
Yes, yes, we are. All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Assalamu alaikum. Take care.